Dobrodošli svi. Evo drugi dan za redom. Jučer je bilo Q&A sa našom guest of honor, Laini Taylor. I said it the wrong way.
Oh, I didn't notice. That's okay.
Danas će nam naša gošća malo ispričati nešto. Iskreno ne znam što, ali vjerujem da će vam svima biti zanimljivo. Na kraju svega toga, ja vjerujem da ima neko ovako pitanje u sredini, da će naša gošća drage volje sve odgovoriti, normalno na engleskom. So this is going to be an English lecture, and it's going to last for like an hour or so. So this is also live streamed on our channel on YouTube. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and
thank you. Hi guys, thank you so much for coming. I'm really, really happy to be here in Croatia for the first time, and I think it's probably one of the best perks of writing success is to get invited to festivals in cool places. And there's been times in the past where, because I'm not a very fast writer and I tend to always be late on a book and behind deadline, I've had to turn down some really cool invitations. And this time I was like, there's no way I'm going to not go. And also at the time last winter when I was invited, it was months before, and I was like, sure, my current book would be done. Oh, of course it'll be done by then. Like, it was already late last summer. There's no way it's not going to be done this summer. So here I am, and the book is still not done. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I wanted to tell you a story to start off with. So some years ago, during my book tour for Muse of Nightmares, I was in the middle of the United States, St. Louis, Missouri. And I was speaking in a public library. Now, I live in Oregon, and I'm originally from California, and it's a simplification, but also mostly accurate to say that the coasts are politically on the left wing, and the middle and south is, right wing and conservative. And I have heard, I don't know if it's true, that the south here is also maybe more religious and conservative, so maybe it's similar. But of course there are Republicans in California and Democrats in Missouri, but the culture is definitely different. And I live in Portland, Oregon, which is so blue or progressive that we call it a bubble, and when you live in a bubble surrounded by like-minded people, it's really easy to lose touch with what the rest of the country is like. So when you go to, say, Texas or Kansas, you have to watch your assumptions and expect to encounter opinions that aren't only the opposite of yours, but aggressively the opposite. So I was in this library, and most of the audience were readers who had come there to hear me and were already fans of my books, but there are usually some patrons from the library who see something going on and drift over to see what it is. And this was during the Trump years, and it was at this exciting time when the bigotry that had for many years, though it was just as deep and present as ever, had been kept beneath the surface somewhat, at least in public discourse, and it had suddenly become acceptable again. And Trump had liberated the voice of racism and white nationalism from any sense of shame. So, Make America Great Again was a big racist coming out party where America's worst nature was validated, celebrated, and emboldened. And I was talking about my book, Muse of Nightmares, the second book in my duology, and in particular about what had emerged for me as the question of the book, which was, what do you do when you're confronted by a mind that cannot be changed, that is absolutely impervious to facts, logic, reason, and every kind of persuasion, and how terrifying that is, and how helpless it makes you feel to know that there is nothing that can ever get through to this person. And this one woman in the audience ejected out of her seat, and she didn't raise her hand or anything. She just leapt up and demanded, "Why should you try to change someone's mind? what gives you the right? We have to agree to disagree. And I was like immediately flooded with adrenaline. You know, it was like she shoved me in the chest practically. It was that kind of challenge. You know, it creates an altered state in your brain. Your fight or flight response is triggered. And it was this phrase, agree to disagree. And I don't know if you have something like that in Croatian, but especially in those years and in the States, it had really, I mean, it's forever, it's been a way of ending an argument with neither side conceding. It's a polite, you know, way of accepting the other person's point of view as valid as yours, or at least you're saying it's their right to not be challenged for their beliefs. And it's the catchphrase of many family dinners across America because we're so deeply divided around politics and religion. And it's a way of keeping the peace with your homophobic grandparents, your racist uncles, and you just don't talk about certain things. And if it comes up, you use agree to disagree to diffuse the situation and disengage. But it's gotten harder over the years as the division has gotten deeper. And by now it's come to mean basically, back off. My racism is just as valid as your non-racism. Basically, I'm proud of my terrible beliefs and deserve to be left in peace. So this woman wanted to know, you know, why should you try to change someone's mind? And this was in the context of my book, and the answer was, because they're gonna kill everyone you love. And she said, oh, well, you know, I haven't read the book, and sat down. But I was now by this time, you know, completely flooded with adrenaline, and I did not let it go. But I said something like, you know, I do not agree to disagree, and then something about how some things are just universally unacceptable, and while it may be your right to hold certain beliefs, it is not your right to not be challenged for them. And that agreeing to disagree completely erases the social contract and, you know, any fine line that might exist around human decency. And you know, for further context, this was around the same time that Trump had changed the immigration policy so that children were being separated from their parents at the border and kept in detainment camps, and small children and toddlers in literal cages. And there are children in cages in my book, which had been written before this happened and had seemed completely dystopian and impossibly horrific, and was now a reality in the United States. And the rhetoric on the right was so hideous and so dehumanizing and so unbelievable, and always coming from Christians who perform the most remarkable mental gymnastics by spouting their bigotry in the name of Jesus. It's really incredible the beliefs people can hold comfortably side by side. But to make a long story short, the woman got up and left. And I'm positive I was not rude to her. But she challenged me and I challenged her back, and we each triggered each other, me by daring to suggest that not all beliefs are equally valid, and her by suggesting that they are. And so she left, which is fine. But the pity of this, and my regret afterwards, is that if I'd handled it differently, she might have read my books. And my books would have done a much better job of challenging her beliefs than I could ever do by arguing with her. Because this is, I think, the secret magic power of fantasy books, is that they're masters of infiltration. They challenge by stealth. All fiction gives us these exploratory terrains of experience, places where we can live other lives, experience other worldviews, try on feelings and relative safety. But people are so densely woven of their allegiances, identities, indoctrination, and all of those things act as filters. And everything we read, witness, experience, learn, hear must pass through these layers of filters of our beliefs, and between culture, education, politics, religion, the chance of anything new making it through are pretty slim. In realistic fiction, all ideas are going to encounter a filter of a fixed and formed belief, which will have reduced the entire issue to the simplicity of us versus them, yes or no, reject or allow. There's no nuance at all. And a belief once formed too often becomes a barrier. And only that which reinforces the belief will be permitted through. And anything else is just deflected. So all the main forms of idea dissemination, journalism, nonfiction, education, debate, and even mainstream realistic fiction just get caught in the filters. Nothing gets through. But fantasy has a chance. And I think it's really funny that literature and its keepers love to dismiss fantasy as unserious, unrealistic, escapist, childish, because those of us who read it know that all the issues in fantasy are human issues, big, important human issues. And whether the characters are actually human or not, all the conflicts and flaws, crimes, triumphs, and emotions are human. Anything that comes from us is about us. But in fantasy, what we do is we remove the obvious tags and labels that would allow the mind to make those immediate judgments of us or them, yes or no, reject or allow. So that first allows things to get past the filter, where secondarily it forces the reader to evaluate them by other, more sophisticated factors. And this is how fantasy is a stealth infiltrator of closed minds. And if you really want to deploy something into a closed mind, your chances of success are far better if you send it by dragon or by humans that are not of the world as we know it. There are a couple of problems with this, of course. Is that the minds most in need of infiltration tend to be those least likely to be reading books, let alone fantasy. And that's a big part of how they get that way, is they're a closed system. They only take in information from a very small circuit. And readers' minds, we all know, are more limber, observant, and empathetic than non-readers' minds, and the world would be a better place if more people read books. Second, people are really good at missing the point. Our brains protect us from negative self-perception, so even when a racist, say, reads a fantasy novel that contains a scathing indictment of racism, and they are fully captured by the author's intent, and they root for the right people, and they hate the villains as they're intended to, they can still walk away from it with their own racism untouched, because they managed to not see themselves in it. It's a great example of this, I think, is how in the US, the police forces wear emblems of the Punisher, the comic book, who's a violent vigilante who is absolutely not on the side of sadistic oppression that is United States law enforcement. But they see themselves anyway. They can somehow see themselves in someone who is the opposite, of what they are. So it's touchy, but I still believe it's worth it to deploy as many of these envoys of counter-belief as possible in every direction. I can't make people read, but I can keep putting stories out there and making them as fun and beautiful and weird and juicy and romantic and mysterious and suspenseful and intense as possible in the hopes that this will get them through the filters. That said, when I'm writing, it's rare that I'm consciously thinking about issues or scheming to put things in people's minds. There's a great quote, I think it's by Terry Pratchett, where he says, "The problem with having an open mind is that people keep trying to put things in it," which is true. But I think when you have an open mind, then you have a better context for what you let into it. But really what I'm thinking about when I'm writing is writing a good story. When I write, I'm not thinking about themes or messages in any overt way. Insofar as my books are about something in a big idea sense, I don't plan it, and I don't even understand it when I'm writing the book. Writing books is how I discover what's going on in my mind, in the deeper layers where the sort of primal worries and unanswered questions seethe around. So I'm going to tell you a story about one of my characters, the same one who sparked the whole mind-changing debate in St. Louis. And first, this requires explaining my writing process a little bit, and ultimately will illuminate why I write the way I do, which is terribly inefficient and terrifying, and also maybe why I write at all. I'm not totally sure. So first, my writing process. I'll back up a few years to a mythic day in my writing life back in September of 2008. I'd written 3 books at this point. One was in the bookstores and 2 more were coming out that year. And I'd begun on my 4th book, and I had been so excited about it. I call it my Ballerinas in Space book because that is kind of what it was, what could be reduced to. The harder I tried to write it, the less fun I was having. I just could not get it to come to life in any way, and I was getting really sick of myself. It was to the point of if any of you guys have ever experienced, is the kind of writing difficulty where your house becomes very, very clean because anything sounds better than writing. So one day I decided to set ballerinas in space aside and write something else, anything else, just for fun, just one day, to remember that writing can actually be fun. And something happened. I sat down with no plan, and I wrote for hours, smiling for most of it. And I have always had a very difficult relationship with writing. I am compelled to do it. It's how I think of myself. I love it, but I also hate it and have incredible difficulty and struggle with perfectionism. And sometimes it feels like driving with the brakes on. It just grinds the whole way, and getting words on the page is really hard. But this day, I couldn't type fast enough. I didn't know where it was coming from. These characters just sprang out of nowhere. It was, they were fully alive, and that had never happened to me before. When other writers say that thing, like, I was just channeling the characters, they were speaking through me, I was like, bullshit. You're lying just to make me feel bad, because I'd never had anything like that happen. And then all of a sudden, I did, and it was this blue-haired art student named Karu in Prague, and her father, who was a monster, and there was a shop where he traded wishes for teeth, and it had doors that opened all over the world, and he wore a wishbone around his neck that she wasn't allowed to touch. And there was this big mystery of who she was and why she was raised by monsters and what the monsters were, and I didn't know. I didn't have answers for any of this, but I needed to know. So yeah, I did not have a story. I didn't have a plot. What I had was a situation, characters, and some burning questions. What does he do with all the teeth? And what is that wishbone all about? And, you know, who is she? Because she had a sense that something was missing, and I didn't know. Like, it was all a big mystery to me. So what started out as one day, just for fun, lasted for 5 years and 3 books and something like 1,500 pages, and became a trilogy. And in that time, Karu and Brimstone and a whole bunch of other characters revealed their world to me in ever-growing spheres. And the story that grew from whimsical beginnings in a tooth shop on the most joyful writing day of my life turned out to be about a war without end, and the cycles of violence and vengeance that repeat endlessly, and oppression and genocide and generational hatred. And it was, I eventually realized, Romeo and Juliet with angels and devils. And we all know how Romeo and Juliet ends, and I did not want to tell that story. I wanted my Romeo and Juliet to fix the world. Small order there. To transform the world into one in which they got to live together and be happy, and no big deal. And so it dawned on me with a kind of slow horror in the middle of this project of unknown scope that I had set myself up for a bitch of a task. Because in order for my angel Romeo and my devil Juliet to fix the world, I had to figure out how to fix the world. And I did not know at all. And this was less of an impediment in the moment than you might think, because it wasn't exactly me that needed to fix the world. It was future me. All I needed to do was get to the end of this book, and then some other Laini in the unknowable future would solve the problem magically. Because here's the thing, I cannot outline. I try. I really try. I make outlines, but they're so thin and random and wrong that they're no use at all. I just can't see the story from the outset, no matter how hard I try, because it doesn't exist yet, and it won't exist until I write it in a process of trial and error, fraught with terror and uncertainty, and writing thousands more words than will end up in the actual book. With Daughter of Smoke and Bone, the beginning was that sort of magical experience, and while it isn't usually like that, it has never happened again, damn it, it's true that when I begin, I have characters, a situation, and questions, but not a plot. Beginning my next book after this trilogy, I combed through all my ideas, and there are so many because I'm not a fast writer, they just languish in there. I actually imagine them as like people waiting in line, and some of them have been there for years, and some of them die in there, and the other ones have funerals for it, and some of them give up and go away and get in other writers' queues. And then I see those books being published, and I'm like, ah! But in this case, it was one of the ideas that had been in my mind the longest, and for decades possibly. And she came from a dream, and I rarely remember my dreams, so it's I'm not really sure, why I remembered this one. But it was just a piece of a little snippet about a young woman who lived high above a human city, and she would send nightmares to the people who lived in the city. And I didn't know why. I didn't know, who she was or any of this stuff. And I didn't know what the story was. But what I needed in the beginning is a certain sense of dazzlement, a sense of my mind catching fire with possibility. Then I start brainstorming, asking myself questions, sort of circling the idea to see it from all angles, asking myself, what if this and why that? And with a wide open mind as other ideas and story elements begin to sort of accrue to it. And this is the highly rigorous and totally scientific process I go through in conceiving a book idea. I gather together a bunch of stuff I think is cool. That's it. I once heard someone say, you need 2 ideas to rub together to make a fire, and I think it's true. At least 2, more like 20, 50. And this idea matchmaking process for me is mysterious and totally irrational. I'm sifting through lots of things that I think are cool and casting around for new cool things to enrich my repertoire, but cool is just the first audition. It's like I'm listening for a hum at a certain frequency, or many hums in harmony. I'm looking for things that seem to me on some intuitive level that I can't explain, likely to interact in rich and weird ways that please me aesthetically, but also create compelling tensions and tantalize me with the potential for fraught, juicy, weird, devastating, and delicious stories. And this collection of elements, once assembled, that gives me the first inkling of a shape I want to discover. That's what I need to start a book. Some elements that hum together and the first inkling of the shape of a story. And I usually can't see or even feel what that shape is yet. I just sense that there is one. So no synopsis, no outline, no ending, no answers, just an inkling and a little bit of dazzlement. So looked at in a certain sober light, it seems like an absolutely insane way to go about writing a book. You're committing yourself to spending months or years on something with no idea of how to do it or where it might take you or if it's going to pay off at all. So there are a lot of ways to write books, and none of them are right or wrong, but some are definitely more efficient and safe. If writing a book is a journey, then this journey is like walking into a jungle without a map. To find your way, you have a choice between a compass or a will-o'-the-wisp, the spheres of fairy light that tempt you deeper and deeper into the forest in order to get you lost. So I think outliners, they're choosing the compass. They're going to get through to the other side in the most direct possible route. Some of us, for reasons we cannot begin to understand, commit to that will-o'-the-wisp every time, essentially volunteering to get lost. Why would a person do that? Why would you choose the will-o'-the-wisp over the compass? And not just once, but every time. It's a really good question that I have smashed up against for years. Why do I do this? So I'll come back to that. The elements that I gathered together for this book, that new book, The Muse of Nightmares, included a lost city whose name had been stolen, a war orphan junior librarian in the greatest library in the world who is obsessed with that lost city, a warrior called the Godslayer, an alchemist, the left behind half-human children of murdered gods, 5 of them, all young people with blue skin, each with his or her own magical ability, who live in hiding from humans who would murder them if they found them, and who were raised as babies, from babies by 2 ghost servants who love them. My Muse of Nightmares is one of the 5, and from her mouth, at twilight, moths erupt and fly down into the city to convey nightmares to the people who live there. And another one of the 5 children is a 6-year-old child who doesn't age. She's been 6 years old for 15 years. There was more, but it's this last one I want to talk about. This 6-year-old child who doesn't age, this is Minya. When I thought up her character, I just thought it was cool. That's my first criterion, right? A child who doesn't age, that's weird. And I imagined her as this mischievous little dark-minded sprite who encourages Sarai, the Muse of Nightmares, to be as bad as she can possibly be, and who really relishes hearing about the torments of these nightmares, and has goaded her towards it all these years. And that was really all I knew about her. That was all she was about, this weird kid who doesn't age. But this was a story about the hidden children of dead gods, and they are survivors of a brutal massacre. And even though the elements of the story were magical and fascinating, there was something else there underneath the cool that made that idea stick. And it was something that had been there all along, even if I didn't know it. Something that hinted at a scope that Minya had to become meaningful in ways I couldn't conceptualize until I created her, which I could only do by putting her in scenes and seeing what she did, until she became real to me. There's a quote by Einstein, "No worthy problem was ever solved in the plane of its original conception," which I love. And he was probably talking about physics, but I think it holds true for fiction too. When I'm gathering my story elements together, I'm thinking about what's cool, the kind of atmosphere I want to create, the world I want to build, surface stuff. The surface of my mind is working on the surface of the story, and that's what I'm conscious of and focusing on. Telling a good story, entertaining myself, trying to make myself feel things in the hope that I can make other people feel them too. But underneath, there's other stuff going on, and I never know what it is until much later. Once I have my elements, I set about finding my way into the story, following the will-o'-the-wisp, getting lost and lost again. And I'm an endless fount of writing metaphors. And I've compared this part of the process to circling a locked house. I'm outside of it, the story is inside, and I have to get in. All the doors and windows are locked, and I can kind of see through the windows a little bit, but not very well. And writing scenes is how I try to, unlock the doors until I finally find one that lets me in. And so at the beginning, I write and rewrite and rewrite. I write endless openings, trying to get the one that feels right. So there's lots of wandering, circling, looping back, making right turns. And with Strange the Dreamer, I wrote so many opening chapters, trying to get into the story. And there was one where the main character, well, it's another story altogether, and I won't go into it, but a story that was supposed to be the Muse of Nightmares, about this girl who sends nightmares. As I was trying to find that opening chapter, what happened many months into this is that the one that ended up finally sticking was not about her at all. And so another character completely stole the story, and it became Strange the Dreamer about this librarian, this war orphan librarian who's obsessed with the Lost City, and he stole the book from Sarai. And so that is one of the things that happened. And that is what unlocked the story and finally let me in, and allowed me to then progress and find the next locked door that I had to get through. And because I'm really, really stubborn, and because I've learned to trust the process, I don't give up, and I always find my way through. And there is a lot of discarded writing. It didn't used to be like this, but now I think increasingly I'm just much more rigorous, and I'm much more willing to write something and then let it go. And so I end up with, I don't know, probably 10 books worth of writing for every book. At least that's what it feels like right now. So for years, this felt like an absurd kind of mania. Other people I knew had easy and less crazy making processes. In each new book, I would be determined, okay, this is the one where I finally learn how to do that. Easy, fast. And I would make plans, But each time the same things happen. You know how in some stories with teleportation or time travel, it's only the physical person who can make it through, like their clothes and weapons can't make it through, so they end up naked and unarmed on the other side. Well, that's kind of like what it's like with me and my plans. My plan can't survive into the actual writing of the book. It's like, the fillings or the glass eye of the time traveler that get left behind in the other time, though hopefully I am not naked when I arrive. But over the past couple of years, a few things have lined up for me to begin to let me understand a little bit better why I keep doing this. There's the pandemic and the many crises taking up space in my brain while I write my current book, which is over deadline and a little crazy making. And I've also been writing a lot about writing on Patreon. And between those two things, this is what I've realized, part of what I've realized. The kind of books that I want and need to write can only be written inefficiently. Yes, outlining and meeting deadlines sounds incredibly pleasant and civilized, but an outline is essentially a map. And you can't map a journey you haven't taken yet, that no one has taken yet. Efficiency is self-defeating because reaching the destination isn't the point of this journey. Future Laini, who has to figure out how to fix the world, isn't waiting on the other side like the next relay runner. The person who staggers out of the forest in 3 months or 3 years is the one who has to figure it out. The point of this journey is to be changed by the journey, to discover the story along the way and become the person who can tell it. And there's this sense throughout of trying to tap into something bigger and better than my conscious mind can deliberately create. And knowing I won't be happy with anything I can deliberately create. It just won't be enough. I'm hungering for something I've tasted a few times, the pure and perfect rush of stars aligning, meaning alighting, a kind of creative grace. Something I've been thinking about a lot over the course of writing my current book is how much of an act of faith this is. It's sort of an elaborate, long game summoning ritual that I hope and pray will pay off. I gather up the elements that spark and scintillate, and I just have to trust that as I coax them through the story, they will evolve and transform into something greater than the sum of their parts, that dazzle me by coalescing into something more meaningful and satisfying than I could have choreographed at the beginning. It feels like magic when it happens. There's really nothing like it. And having experienced it now a few times, I think I'm addicted to it, and anything less just feels flat and limp, undercooked, anemic, and unthrilling. So instead of just telling a story, I guess what I'm doing is trying to foster the circumstances for that magic to happen, like a kind of cultivated serendipity in which the unknown sort of rouses from a dream and adds some secret ingredient to the soup that brings it to the next level. You know how in fairy tales there's the 3 sons or daughters trope, and that'll meet an old beggar woman in the woods, and the first son and daughter and the second son and daughter will, curse her and not give her what she asks, and always, reject and insult her, while the youngest, the good child, always in fairy tales, which I take issue with, I'm the middle child, of course gives her the drink and speaks to her with respect and is granted a boon. Pearls and diamonds will drop from her lips, or the old lady tells him a secret that he needs to survive, and it's crucial. It ends up being crucial. And it struck me that my writing process is kind of like going out again and again in hopes of meeting the magical old woman in disguise. I can't make her be there, and I can't make her grant me a wish. That's not how it works. And even the expectation would make you unworthy of it, but you can keep going to the place and doing all the things that give you a chance of it happening. Keep bringing your bucket of water into the forest every day and hoping to meet magic on the road and be found worthy of it. And in the heart of all this isn't just cool story structure or some plot ideas. It's finding out what was brewing under the surface of all that cool stuff all along, and what it is that's haunting me, what the themes are that I return to again and again, and really who I am, and what I make of the world. When it came to Minya, the child who didn't age, she might have begun as just a cool idea, but she ended up becoming the secret heart of the book, and the embodiment of the question that I learned writing it were the ones haunting me. What can we do about a mind that can be changed? Anyone living through the discourse of this age has to be terrified of that. I don't know what the rhetoric is like here, but in the US, we're going through a stage of imminent fascism, I fear, which is the anti-intellectualization and the demoting of facts, and we get through the day by mocking the other side, but it's terrifying when you see the foundation of reason just crumbling away. So Minya also represented profound childhood trauma and the question of whether victims can be saved. My unexpected challenge to myself in this book became creating a plot situation in which killing the bad guy literally was not an option, that it would not solve your problems, it would make everything much worse. Because I think in fantasy books that is so often the easy solution is you just kill the bad guy. And one of my favorite quotes from all of books is from The Rabbi's Cat, the graphic novel by Johann Sfar, and it's, "Sometimes you kill just one person and it takes care of everything." So I'm on board with that in general, but in fantasy it's sort of an easy solution sometimes. I was much more interested in looking at, what if you can't? What if that's not an option? What if we're not really wanting to sink to killing our enemies? And what if they're not our enemies? And, what if your only hope is to save her instead? Because the bad guy isn't always the bad guy. Sometimes the bad guy is your sister. And She went through hell when she was 6 years old and saved your life and has been saving it ever since in ways you cannot begin to understand. Minya became a symbol for me of desperate hope. Who can be saved? When I was thinking of what I wanted to talk about here, I kept coming back to these things that have been inescapably on my mind these past couple of weird years, these times we're living in, and how catastrophic everything feels. And I doubt there have been many times in history that didn't feel catastrophic to the people living through them. But, and this might be just anxiety talking, it's impossible to have perspective on degrees of catastrophe. Things feel really dire right now. There's the rise of Christo-fascism in the US. You know, the war in Ukraine is not awesome. The many ripple effects of that. And all the other really serious and appalling political and social crises around the world. And, you know, none of that is new. We've never not been like that as a species. It's just a matter of scale. But there's this mutating virus that's the new normal, and that's terrifying. And even that's just sort of a passing fancy compared to this looming game over graphic that is climate catastrophe, which just reshapes our entire context for catastrophe and just feels so huge and overwhelming. And it's just so brain-breaking to be here now in this moment in time watching this minuscule, tiny, infinitesimal fraction of human beings, the ultra-rich, not just make war and cause suffering as they have always done, but actually tank the entire fucking planet right before our eyes for their what-the-fuck short-term profit while we're absolutely helpless to do anything about it. So, by working these things out in my fantasy world, the exercise for myself is to create the world so that I can threaten the world, so that I can become the person who can save the world. Not the world, just the world in my book, because it lets me believe in hope and to live hours of my day in the skin of characters who embody all that's best in people and all that's worst. And it doesn't feel like I decide who wins. I mean, I do, but I can't just decide it. It doesn't feel, you know, when you make decisions in fiction arbitrarily, the reader can feel it. And you have to create a whole story that allows that ending to be authentic, the triumph of hope. And I get to put that in the world and hope that it makes its way past some barriers and that it helps to prevent some barriers from ever forming, and that in a small way I can help to keep the hope alive by being part of this extraordinary medium that we have, which is fantasy. Because fantasy, I believe, is the purest delivery system we have for things our souls crave and that we don't get enough of in daily life. Definitely not the news, and usually not in literature. These big, bold things that we have, that have been the core of story since storytelling began. Honor and sacrifice and true love and hope. Those things seem kind of tacky in mainstream fiction, you know? They seem overblown and unrealistic, but we need them. You know, I have this sort of theory that you know, that tropes are this sort of plugs that plug straight into our soul. You know, it's like we have an outlet in our chest, and the tropes just plug straight into it, and we feel what we want to feel. And there's really direct ways that can be done, and it's almost always through genre fiction and fantasy and romance and things like that. Because you know, what do characters in fantasy novels do but take on the impossible? Not necessarily because they're the best person or hobbit for the job, but because it must be done, and we can't just expect someone else to fix the world. And so I think that, you know, fantasies don't only foster hope and sort of reshape our minds for hope, but they also engender a feeling of personal responsibility that, you know, you have to be the one that does the thing. And, you know, it gives us that, if, you know, reading that message from a young age, if we're fantasy readers, that understanding that we are a crucial part of the problem. And, you know, even if we don't actually get to do that, you know, living in the skin of those characters who get to make the difference, who get to make the change, that changes us, I think, forever. With my current book, I have discovered that my central questions and fears during this time of the catastrophe and doomful thinking, and it's given me a place of retreat and escape, and also, you know, to live in a fantasy world of my creation that is a very alternative way of living than we humans have historically lived, and also a way of framing my concerns and hopes and sort of stripping off those identity tags that would get caught in people's belief filters so that hopefully, if I ever finish this book, those ideas can make it into other people's minds too. So those are some of my feelings about fantasy and what is so awesome about it and why we are so much cooler than everybody else. So yeah, I would love to talk more about it if you guys have any questions or comments. Yeah, I can cheerlead for fantasy books all day, and movies and games and all these things that that let us. Thank you. Anybody have any questions?
I have a question. So you said you studied English literature. How much did the classical work of art inspire your stories? Or did your inspiration come from other fantasy writers?
You know, actually, I was one of those people who stopped reading fantasy pretty young. I mean, it was definitely what made me a reader. But then, even before university, I had fancied myself, you know, quite the mature intellectual and started reading only literature. And by the time I was, you know, studying literature, I wasn't reading fantasy at all. And it was years that I was away from it, and I missed a lot. And I came back to it in my late 20s, and just, you know, I was trying to write literature, I guess, you know, after college. I always wanted to be a writer, but when I was trying to write in that sphere of inspiration, I had nothing to contribute. You know, I was a 22-year-old middle-class white American with no stories. You know, I had like 2, and I wrote them, and that was it. I was out. And I mean, and yes, you know, that whole write what you know is a really terrible truism when you are, you know, when you have had a sort of happy, uneventful life. I actually was in a writing class once where the famous author, on the first day, she said, "Raise your hand if you've had a happy childhood." And I was the only person who raised my hand. And the message was, you have to have childhood trauma to be a writer. And that is so not completely not true. But it, you know, I didn't really have that kind of material to draw from. And I didn't really know what else to do until I started reading fantasy again, and it just blew all the doors open. I realized I could write anything. Like there was, and now, I mean, I can't imagine not having ideas. Like, there's so many more than I could ever write. And, you know, even now, if I try to think of mainstream fiction, like I could get a lot more ideas. But I'm older now, so I have more to write about. But also, I know that fantasy elements would creep in no matter what, because it's just so much more fun. So yeah, I mean, literature, not to, you know, it definitely has an important place, but I just get so sick of the ghettoizing of genre literature and, you know, the decision that it's lesser in some way. And yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Do you have any, I don't know, suggestions for new writers or people who just started to write, stuff like that?
Suggestions for?
I don't know, just kind of advice.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to just clarifying if you were asking about new writers to read or advice for new writers. Yeah, I think my main thing for a long time was that I never finished anything, and that I couldn't really quite. I mean, to be honest, I didn't even start. I have a lot of creative issues that I'm only beginning to understand as well. You know, I think I was late diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, and that, you know, now casts everything in a new light. But also perfectionism, which isn't a diagnosis; it's just a thing that makes it really, really a self-diagnosis. It's this really terrible state where nothing is ever good enough, and you know, you just can get so stuck in rewriting cycle endlessly, and it can just feel totally insane, and it makes progress really difficult. So for a really long time, when I would just write a chapter, and then I didn't know what happened next, so I would rewrite that chapter, and I just never really broke out of that. And it wasn't until you know, you pass by the years where you think when you're young, when you're a teenager, oh, you're going to be a wonderkind. Your first book will be published when you're 22, and it'll win an award, and you'll just, you know, you'll be, and then all of a sudden you're 23, and that wah, 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 and then you're 25, and then you're 28, and time just goes by, and you realize that you're just not doing the thing. The actual one thing that you have to do, if you want any of this to happen, is actually write. And so I started going to writers' conferences, and just, I think, with it, you know, also when I was a young writer, there was no internet. And even when the internet came around, it was a long time before the resources were there and available in the way that they are now. And so it was this really impenetrable world. You know, you would actually put submissions in a mailbox, and you never saw a writer, and never saw an editor or knew what they were looking for, any of that. You know, we had a hard copy of the submission book of who to send, what editors were, you know, and it was just, it didn't feel real. And so then starting to go to writers' conferences, you know, you're surrounded by people who have finished their manuscripts, and editors who are looking for manuscripts, and you just realize this is a real business, and those editors need books constantly, and those other people are finishing books, and can I really not do that? And so it really made it real, and kind of finally gave me the momentum to finish a book. So that was huge for me, that finishing. But I know that, you know, the industries have, you know, just are ever evolving, and not in good ways necessarily. Publishing only gets more difficult to break into, and I don't know how many of you guys have been aware of the trial going on in the US right now. You know, we call them the big five publishers. It's Random House already ate up Penguin, so they're Random House, or Penguin Random House now. One of them ate the other, I don't know. And then there's Simon & Schuster, there's Hachette, and there's these mega publishers that have a lot of money, HarperCollins. And right now, Penguin Random House is trying to eat Simon & Schuster. And this is a violation potentially of our antitrust laws, our anti-competition laws. And so there's a trial going on right now, and what it has revealed is that the CEOs of publishing know nothing, like absolutely nothing. And they really only care about the mega bestsellers. That's like, and the only numbers they know at all are like the top 1% of books that sell millions. Like, and they have no idea about the rest of the industry. And it's just, there's a lot of people in the industry right now being like, what the fuck, you know? Like, you know, just realizing that the money that's thrown around and the absolute lack of data too. It's these people, they're not business people. They're like, I don't know, it's just crazy. So right now, if you're on Twitter, like I'm publishing Twitter right now, it's just this jaw drop moment as people like watch this trial and just can't believe how completely fucked the publishing world is. So that's interesting. So it's hard. It's hard to, you know, to continue in the face of that, or know like how to go about it. But I do also know that there's a lot of really wonderful people that are editors and that are constantly acquiring books and looking for the next book, and that, you know, the only thing we can do, and it's freeing in a way, the only thing we can do is do our best to create a manuscript that can't be ignored. And it's really the only thing. You know, there are books that are published all the time that you're like, that's not that great, how'd that make it? But the best way is to just really work on your craft and try to book you love so much that you can't imagine that other people won't love it too, and then try to engage with that Byzantine publishing process. Yeah. Finishing, writing what you love. Yeah. Yes?
When you talked about publishing, so today it's much easier to self-publish a book. So a lot of writers go that way, and then, you know, if the book gets the momentum and gets popular, especially on social media, then the publishing houses pick it up. So what are your opinions on this?
My opinion is, I don't know a lot about it, but my understanding is that they don't just happen to do well. Like, you have to know how to work all the algorithms, how to do advertising, how to really get it seen, because you know, in the sort of, there was a golden period for self-publishing when Amazon was first starting to do it, and people who got in and knew how to do it started to make big money. And then Amazon started changing things, and a lot more people jumped in, and so there's a ton of competition. It's much harder to get seen. So you really need to know how to do everything. I mean, you're a full publishing house. You have to, edit, design, write your own copy, do your own advertising, and it's really tricky. But and also you have to produce a lot faster because independent authors, their readership tends to expect several books a year from them. So you have to really keep on it and always be giving new content. So that works for some people and less well for others. But I think it's amazing. It's an amazing outlet to have because the publishing. We just sort of like laugh about what the publishing split is, but you guys probably know this, but the publisher gets between what, 95 and 90% of the profit. The author gets like 5 to 10% of the profit for their minor contribution. But also the publisher does a lot. Or the expectation is that they will do a lot. The reality is they only do those things for a very few books. So I got lucky with Daughter of Smoke and Bone because of circumstances. It's not my first book. A lot of people think it is, but it was actually my 4th book. So I had 3 books before it, so I know what a normal publishing experience is like, and that is that you do not have a publicist, you do not go on a book tour, nothing really happens. And then with Daughter of Smoke and Bone, one of these miraculous things had happened where my 3rd book, which is called Lips Touch, had been nominated for the National Book Award, which is the highest award in the US in book publishing, one of. And that brought me to the attention of editors in a way that really nothing else could have. And it's something you can't create, you can't make that happen. It was a complete fluke. And it's one of those magical moments that I will never forget. And getting that phone call, because there's very few things in publishing. You sort of daydream or imagine those moments where you get a phone call and someone's going to publish your book, but mostly it's a series of emails that fritter away. Like maybe, like by the time you get any good news, you've so had to deaden yourself to it because you're preparing for disappointment that like it's hard to get excited. And then everything happens so far in advance. By the time your book comes out, you finished it 2 years ago, and you're not. So when those things happen, like an award phone call out of the blue, it was incredible, and that allowed my agent to sell that book in a book auction that then made it, go for a lot more money, that then made the publisher then have to invest in marketing. And it was just luck, and it was a completely different kind of experience. It was like, what? There's publicists? What? And that was also meant foreign translations, which was amazing. I had like maybe 2 before, and now I have 38 languages for Daughter of Smoke and Bone, and it's the coolest thing. So all of those things were, one of those luck factors, and also the timing in the industry. That book was published by the same publisher as Twilight, while the publisher was rich with Twilight money, and that's not really the case anymore. Most publishers don't have that kind of money to spend anymore, and the industry's changed. And so I had really good luck, and yet, at the same time, there's really nothing you can do. I do have to just really, I know there's nothing that I can do to sell books. I can be on Twitter or whatever. That does not sell books. Like, unless you're one of those people that's really good at TikTok or something like that. Like, it's just your natural. I have to rely on the publisher to do that. I can't make them do it. And the only thing I can do is try to write a book that they will really want to market, and that it will have the luck, that it will be the one that gets chosen for marketing at the right time. Yeah, and then for indie authors, I think there's a lot of resources online. There's a lot of people that talk about it and kind of, give information about the marketing and things like that. And it's something that I'm definitely interested in knowing more about, but it seems hard. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's great, and some of them have done really well, but I think by far most of them don't make a lot of money. Like, there's just those few that are really good at it, and yeah, I think it's probably the same percentage of successful versus not successful as in traditional publishing, But
you said that childhood trauma is not a necessary condition, right? And that's a good thing. So we don't have to molest children in order to bring up the next generation.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good thing. But in your talk, you mentioned thoughts troubling you as a source of inspiration, and you seem to have a slightly bleak worldview. Would that be a fair assessment? And sort of an anxious perspective on current world events, right? So, do you think, were you a sort of a more carefree person without a care in the world, that you would be a less successful or less efficient writer?
No, I don't think it would be. I don't think I would necessarily be. I don't think success or efficiency really are a factor so much. I think there are plenty of massively successful authors that, really, for example, the romance authors are the best-selling authors in the world, by far, by huge margins. Romance sells more than all other books put together. Massive success. And those are not, there's obviously crisis and trauma, but they're not dealing with the bleakness of the world in any way, even processed through the lens of fantasy or anything. And then as far as efficiency, I think that really just is a matter of what kind of brain you have, what kind of neurons you have, and how you process information. But I do think that it is a certain kind of book, and a certain, I would be writing very different books if I was a more carefree person, if I wasn't, freaked out about humans doing the things they do. Yeah, I think, it may be, I don't know, I would definitely be writing a different kind of book. And sometimes, I like the idea of writing that different kind of book on the side, like still doing the kind of book that I can only do. But like, what if I was also able to, have a challenge to write a book on a formula, which I've never been able to do, like, write it in a month on this formula and see what happens just for fun, and indie publish it or something like that. Like, that it definitely interests me as a challenge to see what that would be like if I didn't engage the, trying to discover, letting the story lead, if I really was determined. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know why that made me think of it, but did you guys hear what happened yesterday with Salman Rushdie?
Yeah.
Jesus Christ. Yeah. Salman Rushdie was attacked and stabbed on stage yesterday and is in critical condition in the hospital. This, fatwa has been out on him for 30 years and was never rescinded. So I guess that's what happens to the authors who are really taking on serious issues, right? Beware. So, really pulling for him. He's an incredible writer. And it's awful. Did I tell you about that? Yeah. Yes?
I don't know if you can hear me from here, but how has woke culture and cancel culture reflected on your auto-censorship?
Woke culture and cancel culture. It has definitely been very visible in the sort of Twitter community around young adult publishing. And Twitter community is not reflective of, the mainstream world, but it can feel like it, since it's like a main place that you see people thinking and talking. And there have been books that have been canceled by their publisher because an advanced reviewer criticized it as, colonialist or something. And so publishers are really leery of being labeled as, publishing things that aren't, that are not sensitive in the way that they're required to be sensitive now. And I think it definitely is, making people consider what they write for the better, because there certainly is a lot of work that should be done in that way. There are stories being told by white middle-class Americans that should not be being told by white middle-class Americans. They should be being told by somebody else. Ideally, that are absolutely cultural appropriation. Of course, everyone can write what they want, but again, that doesn't mean that just because somebody is free to do something, it doesn't mean we shouldn't challenge them for it, or that we shouldn't. And in fantasy, it's a very complicated issue. For sure. And I have a book or a story that I wrote years ago that I would not write today, and it takes place in British India, and it has a white character who has kind of a savior, or has definitely a savior quality to them, like a white savior quality. I would never write that today. I would be, yeah, and you know, am I glad that I wrote that story? I know it's hard to say. I loved it at the time, but now I'm a little about it because I know more about how that story makes people feel, makes some people feel. So I think it is affecting the industry somewhat for the better, but that the conversation around it is scaremongering a lot, and there's always this, oh, what is the poor white male author to do? And yet you look at the statistics, and it's still all mostly white male authors, you know, or white female authors, and they feel threatened by their livelihood, but in reality, they're still the ones that are getting the better publishing contracts, and nothing is changing as much as it seems like in the marketplace of Twitter or social media. So, yeah, I mean, I think that we went through a period, or going through a period, of not really knowing how to react, and some people being way aggressive, overly aggressive, and judgmental, and then it'll hopefully level out and actually have an impact for the positive. And the sorts of authors, one of the things is that publishing is very white and upper class profession. It's hard to break into publishing as in the publishing house if you don't have independent resources, because it's really expensive to live in New York, and they tend to hire 22-year-olds whose parents are paying their rent so that they can get this job. And so it's really, there's not much diversity in publishing, and so those editors are naturally sort of drawn to still certain stories that are mostly white, and like there just has to be a lot of change, and we hope that can begin to happen more, that this conversation can be positive instead of being seen as censorship. Yeah, when I write, I definitely am aware of it, like not writing things that, yeah, I'm definitely aware of it and scared to get things wrong. We are expected now, if you are writing characters of a identity that is not your own, to hire sensitivity readers to see if you fucked up, if there's anything you should change that's going to be offensive to people. And I think that's good. And sometimes people do all of that, and then people still shit on their book, but you can try your best, and it definitely has affected my thinking, but in a growth kind of way, like there was a lot I wasn't at all aware of 10 years ago. There was a change that I was able to make in Days of Blood and Starlight when it was reprinted. Actually, I just realized that it hadn't been made, though I thought it was, but there's a special edition of it coming out, and I was finally able to make the change, but it was like a minor exchange in dialogue between two characters that somebody brought to my attention was insensitive to trans people. And it wasn't about that at all, but I could see it was a gender issue that it was just like, to me at the time, it was like a throwaway comment, but then I realized, now, and I was able to make that change. And I wouldn't have said it now because I'm just more aware of, conversations are much more prominent now about things than they were 10 years ago. So, yeah, I think it's good. Hopefully we can all, learn to be more accepting and to write characters in a more sensitive way. Yeah.
You said in your chaotic writing experience that you try to research and somehow relay your messages and questions to the reader. Do you, when you write, have some demographic in mind, or do you just go with it? And do you ever get surprised when someone comes up to you and says, "Oh, I've read your books," and you're like, "Wow, this person really?"
I mean, so most of my books have been, all of my books so far have been for younger readers, targeted, published by publishers who publish for younger readers. So when I'm writing them, I'm writing for myself as a younger person and myself now. So I think, in my books are published in some countries as adult and some countries as young adult, but in the US as young adult. And so I do have a certain mindfulness that I'm writing for young adults. And I think that I couldn't necessarily quantify exactly what that is, but I am aware of that readership. Not in a pandering way, but in the things that are the most interesting and intense and relevant to younger readers. And I'm not, going to be writing about things that only people my age, that are concerns. I definitely am mindful of my younger readership. I'm writing my first adult novel now, and it's not that different. The sex scenes can be a little more explicit, maybe. But besides that, and as far as the demographic of readers, in the States, like a huge amount of readers of young adult books are adults, and so that never surprises me anymore. But sometimes when I travel, one example is when I go to Mexico, I have really great readers there, and there's a lot more male readers who come to readings there, and like teenage boys. And you think of this like machismo in Mexico, but in fact, like I would say almost 50% of the people who come to my events in Mexico are teenage boys. And it's awesome because I never in the States. I mean, I could probably count on one hand the amount of teenage boys I've seen at my book events in the States. So that's cool to see. And sometimes I get emails I think that they tend to think that I'm going to be more surprised when it's like a 70-year-old man that's writing and saying, I read your book, or a active military person in Afghanistan thinks I'll be surprised. And I'm pleased, and more than surprised maybe. Well, does anybody have any last questions? Otherwise, thank you so much. Oh, yeah.
Will you be signing books today?
Yeah, I think I just signed right up here. After? Yeah, thank you. Thank you guys so much for coming and for having me. I just love it here, and so happy I got to come to Croatia. So thank you so much.